The sky was not blue. It had not been blue for years, or at least it would never feel blue again. Instead, it hung low, heavy, a swirling gray canopy of ash and dust, blotting out the sun and the warmth of a world that had once been familiar. The bombs had fallen. Cities, monuments, homes, the lives of millions, reduced in the blink of an eye to smoke, rubble, and silence. The flash had come and gone, leaving nothing but scars on the land, on the air, and deep inside the hearts of those who had survived. For those who had lived through it, every moment after the blasts was a battle against despair. The streets that had once hummed with the rhythm of daily life were now cracked, broken, and eerily quiet. Cars sat abandoned, their windows blown out, their engines cold. Skyscrapers leaned like wounded giants, skeletal and hollow, some still smoldering from fires that would never fully die. Ash covered everything. It clung to hair, clothing, skin, to the very lungs of the living, and the taste of it lingered like a bitter reminder with every breath. Those who emerged from their shelters did so with trembling hands and haunted eyes. Children, some too young to remember the world before, clutched at the hands of parents who were terrified, yet determined to survive. Parents, whose faces were streaked with soot and tears, had no answers, no guidance, no hope beyond the instinct to move, to breathe, to stay alive. Survival was now a language of actions, not words. Every step could be the difference between life and death. Every decision carried weight unimaginable before the war. The air itself was an enemy. Radiation hung invisible, lingering like a ghost over ruined neighborhoods and shattered highways. Water had turned toxic, rivers and lakes flowing with chemicals and ash. Food no longer grew as it once had. Seeds buried in scorched soil refused to germinate, and scavenged supplies were few and far between. Even the most mundane actions, stepping outside, opening a door, taking a drink, had become exercises in courage, chance, and calculation. Life as it had existed had vanished. And yet people moved, tentatively, fearfully. But they moved. Survivors had become shadows among shadows, learning to navigate ruins, to step lightly on broken streets, to keep their heads down, and to listen to the whispers of the wind for signs of danger. The silence was deceptive. It was not peace, but a waiting. Every groan of a collapsing building, every distant crack of shifting debris, every cough or scream carried with it the reminder that the world was no longer forgiving. Grief was everywhere. Not just the grief of loss, but the grief of impossibility. Parents could not find their children. Couples searched for one another through streets of ash and rubble. Communities had dissolved, replaced by small, wary clusters of survivors, each learning fast that trust was fragile and rare. Hunger gnawed at their bellies, fatigue weighed on their bones, and the cold wind cut through the thin layers of clothing they had cobbled together from scraps. And still, even in despair, the human heart beat stubbornly. In the ruined city, the survivors began to sight the small signs of endurance. A patch of green pushing through ash, a small stream of cleaner water hidden in a collapsed canal, the faint warmth of a fire someone had managed to keep alive. These were fleeting moments, fragile and easily destroyed, but they reminded the survivors that existence could still cling to the edge, that life, even here, was not fully defeated. And yet, The world demanded everything from them. Every day, every hour, every breath was a negotiation with danger. Radiation sickness lurked in invisible clouds, bringing nausea, fever, and hair loss. The structural skeletons of the old world threatened to crush the careless. And among these physical hazards, the psychological wounds festered. Fear, despair, and guilt were companions as real as hunger or thirst. To survive, they had to be endured, controlled, and sometimes embraced. Even in the silence of a world destroyed, a spark persisted. Human instinct, stubborn and relentless, refused to die. Survivors moved among the ruins not only because they had to, but because to stop would be to surrender entirely. Every careful step, every scavenged scrap of food, every decision to push forward through ash-filled streets became a testament to the strength of the human spirit. The world had changed irrevocably. The cities that had defined human achievement were gone. The future, once imagined as endless possibility, was now a constant fight for survival. Yet, among the smoke and ruins, among the shadows and the grief, the survivors carried with them a fragile truth. As long as they drew breath, they could endure. They could survive. And in that survival lay the first, trembling hope that humanity might one day rise from the ashes of its own destruction. The first steps into the world after the war were never easy. The survivors who had huddled in basements, bunkers, or makeshift shelters now emerged into streets that were unrecognizable. The sky remained a choking gray. Ash fell in slow, relentless waves, coating faces, clothing, and lungs alike. Each inhalation was a gamble, each step a decision weighed against risk and instinct. The war had ended in a flash, but its consequences lingered in every broken corner of the world. Buildings, once proud symbols of human achievement, now leaned precariously, their skeletons exposed, steel beams twisting like tortured bones. Streets were fractured, cracked into jagged patterns by heat and shockwaves. Vehicles sat abandoned, some scorched to blackened husks, others just frozen mid-motion, the echoes of panic trapped inside. Fires smoldered in the distance, casting faint orange glows through the ashen haze, their smoke curling into the heavy clouds above. For those stepping into this wasteland, every move demanded attention. A single misjudged step could plunge a foot into a hidden pit or trigger the collapse of a weakened structure. Dust and ash clogged every orifice, stinging eyes, throat, and nose. Radiation lay invisible, yet deadly, drifting in the air, settling on surfaces, poisoning the water, and lurking in the soil. Survivors learned quickly: stay low, stay covered, and always move with purpose. Hesitation could be fatal. Families huddled together, holding hands, voices quiet, almost afraid to speak. Children, some only dimly aware of the life that had once been, clung to their parents with wide eyes that reflected both wonder and terror. For them, the world was a ruinous playground, but one where every sound, the groan of metal, the crash of falling debris, the distant echo of fire, was a threat. Parents whispered guidance, words meant to teach stealth and caution, but their own fear was ever present, a shadow over every movement. Survivors scoured the streets, looking for the small things that could mean life. A broken backpack might contain food, water, or medicine. A collapsed store could hide a stash of canned goods, though the risk of radiation made every find uncertain. Each decision, entering a building, scavenging a car, crossing a cracked street, was measured, weighed, and prayed over. Even the simplest action carried consequences invisible until it was too late. The human cost of the war became immediately visible in the streets. Corpses lay where they had fallen, some still clutching remnants of their lives. Burned, decayed, or frozen in place by the chaos, they were a constant, grim reminder of mortality. Survivors had to navigate not only the physical hazards of the environment, but also the psychological impact. Shock, grief, and fear were constant companions, weighing down steps and clouding judgment. The emotional burden was as lethal as the radiation. Trust, once taken for granted, had become fragile. Among the few survivors, some banded together for safety, forming small groups that shared knowledge, water, and supplies. Others became predators, willing to steal, lie, or kill for the smallest scrap of life-sustaining material. Every encounter with another human was a question, friend or foe. To survive meant to be cautious, to watch, and to anticipate the intentions of others before revealing your own. Mistakes were costly. Movement became a careful choreography. Survivors learned to travel in shadows, to avoid open streets, to listen for the sounds of collapsing buildings, shifting debris, or the occasional distant fire. Even the wind was an enemy, carrying ash and radiation across open areas. Paths had to be plotted with care, every route examined, every alternative considered. Improvisation became skill, skill became instinct, and instinct became the thin line between life and death. Every new day brought challenges. Water was a prize, often contaminated, requiring purification through scavenged materials or cautious waiting. Food had to be rationed, divided in exact portions, or risked spoiling before it could sustain the small group. Medicine was non-existent, leaving wounds, infections, and radiation exposure to run their course. Survival was not glamorous. It was a brutal calculation of priorities, endurance, and patience. Yet, even in the bleakest moments, life persisted. A small green sprout pushing through ash, a stream of water clear enough to drink after careful filtering, a fire someone managed to keep alive. These were small victories, fragile yet sustaining. They reminded survivors that the world, while shattered, was not devoid of life. That even in ruin, there were moments of hope to cling to, however faint. The first steps in this new world were not merely physical, they were emotional. Every movement was a negotiation with fear, grief, and the instinct to survive. Every glance over a shoulder, every cautious crossing of a cracked street, was a reminder of how fragile life had become. Yet the human spirit persisted. With every step, survivors learned, adapted, and endured. They were living reminders that even after the brightest fire and the darkest night, life continues, stubborn, unyielding, and desperate to survive. The nuclear war had ended in a flash, but its shadow stretched on infinitely. The world that emerged was alien, hostile, and dangerous, yet humanity clung to it with trembling, fierce hands. Every survivor who took these first steps carried the weight of memory and hope, the memory of what was lost, and the hope that somehow, against all odds, life could continue. The world had become a museum of decay, a place where survival depended on courage, cunning, and the constant negotiation with danger. Every street was a puzzle of ruin, every building a potential death trap. And in this new reality, scavenging was not merely a task, it was a matter of life and death. Those who dared to leave the fragile security of their shelters entered a world that demanded vigilance with every heartbeat. The survivors moved in small groups or alone, their bodies tense, eyes constantly scanning for threats both visible and invisible. A collapsed supermarket promised canned goods and bottled water, but each doorway was a potential hazard. Floors weakened by fire and radiation could give way beneath a single step, sending a human into darkness below. Shelves that once held abundance now contained little but dust, shattered glass, or twisted metal. Picking through the debris required hands that were steady, minds that were alert, and nerves hardened by fear. Even the smallest finds were victories. A bottle of clean water, a tin of beans, a fragment of medicine. These scraps became treasures, giving hope and sustenance in a world stripped bare. Every item carried weight beyond its immediate utility. Water meant life for another day. Food meant strength to continue. Medicine meant the difference between succumbing to illness or pressing on. Scarcity transformed every object into something sacred, and every choice into a moral decision. Who gets the water? Who eats first? Survival demanded these choices, and they tore at the soul. Radiation was the silent predator, invisible yet lethal. Survivors learned to read the landscape, recognizing the gray shimmer of fallout on rooftops, the fine dust coating metal, and the sickly green of plants that had absorbed poison. Clothing became armor. Makeshift masks filtered the poisoned air, and routes were planned to avoid known hotspots. But knowledge could only go so far. One wrong step could bring nausea, burns, or slow death. And so every scavenger moved with extreme caution, balancing the need for supplies against the ever-present threat of contamination. The environment itself had turned against humanity. Streets were choked with debris, fires smoldered in buildings that had resisted collapse, and wind carried ash that stung skin and lungs alike. Animals were scarce, and those that remained were often hostile or mutated by radiation. Water sources were uncertain, sometimes a trickle from a hidden pipe, sometimes a poisoned stream. And even then, drinking required careful filtration or risked sickness. The world was unforgiving, and the slightest miscalculation could mean the end. Other humans were often as dangerous as the environment. Hunger and desperation twisted morality. Small bands of survivors could be allies or threats, depending on the balance of power in any given encounter. A stranger in the ruins could be a scavenger seeking supplies like yourself, or a predator willing to kill for a scrap of food. Trust had become a currency more valuable than anything else, and every interaction carried the weight of possibility, hope or death. Every choice had consequences. Scavenging was not just about finding food and water. Survivors gathered tools, scraps of metal, wood, or cloth to patch shelters, construct weapons, or fortify positions. Each object, however trivial it might have seemed in the old world, could mean survival. A metal pipe could be a weapon. A torn sheet could become a mask. A broken window frame could barricade a doorway. Ingenuity was survival, and creativity became the most valuable skill in a world stripped of order. Every expedition into the ruins left emotional scars as well. Survivors walked among the remnants of lives that had been snuffed out in an instant. Burned photographs, twisted toys, and charred furniture were haunting reminders of the world before. Some cried openly, others swallowed grief to maintain focus. Each new discovery of death, bodies caught in rubble, signs of starvation, remnants of families, was a reminder that survival was not only a matter of skill, but also of endurance of spirit. The psychological weight of scavenging was relentless. Fear was constant. Adrenaline sustained the body, but could not shield the mind from despair. The threat of radiation sickness, injury, or betrayal hung like a cloud over every action. Yet the survivors pressed on, because the alternative was certain death. To stay in a shelter without supplies was to surrender to hunger and poison. To venture outside was to risk immediate violence or contamination. There was no right answer. Only choices weighed against impossible odds. Even as they scavenged, survivors began to learn patterns in the ruin. They discovered pockets of relative safety, a collapsed corner that shielded from wind, a patch of vegetation that had absorbed less radiation, a hidden stream that offered water for the day. Observation and adaptation became survival tools. Experience mattered more than courage alone, because in a world reshaped by nuclear fire, ignorance was fatal. And yet, despite the hardships, moments of fragile hope emerged. A can of beans found intact in a broken pantry, a purifying cloth fashioned from scraps, a brief human connection with another survivor. All were sparks against the encroaching darkness. Each success, each small acquisition, reinforced the stubborn truth that life persisted, even here, in a world of ash, death, and despair. Scavenging was survival. Survival was a battle waged in silence, in shadow, in ash. Every footstep, every hand, every breath had weight. The world no longer offered abundance. It demanded endurance, strategy, and constant vigilance. The nuclear war had ended the world as it was, but it had not ended the human spirit. Those who scavenged, who learned, who adapted, became the backbone of a fragile humanity still clinging to existence. And so the survivors pressed on. Every scavenged morsel, every clean drop of water, every safe corner claimed became a small victory. They were ghosts moving through a world that had become hostile and alien, but they were alive. They endured, and in the endurance, there was the faintest glimmer of hope that even in a planet scorched by fire, humanity could persist. The cities had died long before the last survivors stepped into them. Once bustling with life, commerce, and the daily rhythm of humanity, they were now tombs of steel and concrete, hollowed out by fire and ash. Streets that had once carried laughter, cars and crowds were now choked with rubble, twisted vehicles, and the silent reminders of those who had perished. The wind swept through the ruins like a mournful sigh, carrying the bitter scent of smoke, decay, and the acrid tang of radiation. Every building, every alleyway, every collapsed rooftop told the story of human ambition cut short by a flash of fire that had reshaped the world in an instant. For survivors, entering these ghost cities was a test of both courage and sanity. Silence was deafening. The absence of sound, the emptiness of streets, and the skeletal remains of humanity's creations created a dissonance that gnawed at the mind. Every step echoed unnaturally, amplifying the feeling of being watched by ghosts. Shadows played tricks on tired eyes. Reflections in broken windows seemed to move on their own. The human brain, wired for life in crowded, vibrant spaces, rebelled against this void. Fear was constant, sometimes justified, sometimes born of imagination, but always present. The first challenge was navigating the physical hazards. Streets were fractured, with deep fissures from the heat of nuclear fire. Bridges were reduced to twisted metal skeletons, and tunnels caved in without warning. Buildings stood precariously, their steel supports bent, concrete cracked, and floors unstable. A single misstep could send a survivor plummeting into darkness or falling rubble. Doors and staircases were warped, sometimes impassable, forcing the survivors to climb, crawl, or improvise new paths. Even objects that had survived the blast, the skeleton of a car, a metal railing, posed dangers if shifted or unstable. Radiation lurked in every corner. Ash coated every surface, thickening in layers over cars, streets, and furniture. Survivors moved cautiously, avoiding areas where the ground glimmered with the subtle sheen of fallout, or where plants and soil carried the toxic signature of lingering radiation. Clothing and scarves offered little protection. Masks and makeshift filters could only mitigate so much. Some risks were unavoidable, and every survivor carried the knowledge that every hour outside could bring illness, sickness, or slow, painful death. The human element added another layer of danger. Not all who survived were friendly. In the ruins, desperation bred opportunism and violence. Small groups of scavengers could be either allies or predators. Every encounter required judgment. A word too loud, a step too confident, or a look perceived as hostile could end in theft, assault, or murder. Trust was a fragile thread in a world stripped of law and order, and survivors learned quickly to read body language, tone, and intent before revealing their presence. Survival demanded caution, intuition, and sometimes ruthless calculation. Yet among the ruin, traces of the old world persisted. Graffiti scorched into walls, tattered flags still clinging to poles, billboards burned but partially intact. These relics reminded survivors of what had been lost. Sometimes, in quieter moments, they stumbled across remnants of ordinary life, a child's toy, a photograph frozen in time, a diary scorched at the edges, but legible enough to hint at stories long ended. These objects were ghosts of a past humanity that had once thrived, and they weighed on the heart as heavily as the ash on their shoulders. Despite the horror, necessity drove them forward. Ghost cities were also repositories of resources. Abandoned supermarkets, hospitals, and homes offered water, canned food, medicine, and materials for shelter or defense. Every exploration was a gamble. Entering a collapsed building could yield sustenance or trap a survivor under rubble. Radiation zones could poison them, and other humans might be waiting in ambush. Every scavenging run was a test of courage, knowledge, and survival instinct. Emotional strain compounded the dangers. The constant confrontation with death, the eerie emptiness, and the memories of lives lost created a pressure that threatened to crush the spirit. Survivors struggled with grief for family and friends they could not find, guilt for those left behind, and the creeping despair of a world that no longer made sense. Each day required the suppression of emotion just to function, yet the human heart could not be entirely silenced. Tears, anger, and rage found their way into moments of solitude, in corners of ruined rooms or under skeletal bridges, private expressions of grief that reminded the survivors of what it meant to be alive. They began to mark their paths, leaving subtle signs for themselves or others: a bent piece of metal, a chalk mark, a stack of stones. These markers offered guidance, small reassurance that someone had survived before them, and that others might follow. Navigation through ghost cities became a skill, combining memory, observation, and instinct. Every block crossed, every building searched, was a small victory against a world that sought to extinguish them. At night, the ghost cities became even more dangerous. Darkness cloaked hazards and amplified fear. The wind howled through shattered buildings, carrying ash and debris that cut like knives against exposed skin. Survivors huddled in makeshift shelters, basements, collapsed buildings, or improvised tents of tarps and scrap metal, listening to the silence and wondering what other humans or unseen dangers lurked nearby. Sleep was shallow, punctuated by nightmares of fire, explosions, and death. Yet even brief rest was precious, a fragile reprieve to gather strength for the next day's scavenging. Amid the ruin, moments of connection still glimmered. Survivors helped each other lift debris, shared precious food and water, and comforted one another in the quiet hours. Trust, once rare, was a lifeline. Compassion was survival. Every act of care or kindness became a rebellion against the world that had been destroyed. These moments, small as they were, reminded survivors that humanity could endure, even in the shadow of apocalypse. Ghost cities were a testament to both human achievement and fragility. They were monuments to lives abruptly ended, lessons carved into stone and steel, and arenas of survival where every choice mattered. To move through them was to confront the enormity of loss and the persistence of life simultaneously. Survivors emerged from each exploration changed, wiser, wearier, and more determined. Every street crossed, every building entered, every morsel scavenged became part of the ongoing fight to exist in a world burned by nuclear fire. And in this fragile persistence, hope endured. The ghost cities were dangerous, cruel, and unrelenting, yet they offered resources, shelter, and the faintest sense of continuity. For those willing to risk their lives, careful and aware, the ruins became a landscape of survival, harsh, demanding, and unforgiving, yet offering a path forward for humanity to endure in the aftermath of devastation. The air was thick with poison. Invisible, unrelenting, it lingered in every shadow, every corner of the world the bombs had spared. Radiation, the silent, unseen enemy, was everywhere. A ghost that could not be fought directly, but whose presence demanded respect, vigilance, and constant calculation. Survivors soon realized that the nuclear war had not ended in a flash alone. It had left a lingering death in its wake, one that could strike hours, days, or weeks after exposure. Every breath carried risk. Every touch of ash, water, or soil carried consequence. Those who had survived the initial blasts found themselves now battling an enemy they could neither see nor hear. Their skin itched, their throats burned, their stomachs churned. Some felt dizzy as they navigated the ruined streets, their movements uncertain, each step measured against the possibility that the world itself was turning against them. Radiation sickness was a cruel companion. It crept in silently, manifesting as nausea, fatigue, fever, hair loss, and eventually, if unchecked, organ failure and death. The survivors learned to read the signs, but knowledge was a poor shield against fate. Water had become one of the most dangerous and valuable resources. Streams, rivers, and wells were often contaminated with radioactive particles. Drinking without caution could mean slow poisoning. Boiling water or filtering it with makeshift materials provided some defense, but even then, risk remained. Every sip carried uncertainty, every drop was precious, and the mental weight of deciding who would drink first or how much to ration was crushing. Hunger and thirst competed with radiation as constant, gnawing threats, shaping decisions, behaviors, and morality in ways unimaginable before the war. Illness did not limit itself to radiation. In the absence of functioning hospitals, disease spread unchecked. Infections from minor cuts or scratches could become fatal. Burns from fires or falling debris left survivors vulnerable. Food scarcity weakened bodies, and fatigue lowered resistance. The smallest mistake, stepping on rusted metal, ingesting contaminated food, or neglecting personal hygiene, could spiral into illness that no one could treat. Each survivor carried a fragile body that demanded respect, care, and constant attention, yet the world offered little support beyond instinct and improvisation. The psychological toll was relentless. Survivors walked through landscapes haunted by the remnants of life that had been, ghosts of the familiar and reminders of loss. Each face in memory: the child lost, the parent who did not survive, the stranger who had once smiled, returned in moments of quiet, striking with weighty sorrow. The constant vigilance required to avoid environmental hazards compounded the emotional strain. Fear, grief, and guilt were as palpable as the ash in the air. Survivors carried them invisibly, layered atop physical fatigue, hunger, and injury. And sometimes these emotional wounds cut as deeply as any radiation burn. Traveling through irradiated zones demanded ingenuity. Clothing was layered and reinforced, scarves wrapped tightly to cover noses and mouths, masks fashioned from cloth or scavenged materials. Paths were carefully chosen, avoiding areas where fallout had concentrated or where the wind carried ash in dangerous gusts. Yet, even with care, exposure was inevitable. Some survivors had burns, rashes, or persistent coughs. Others displayed subtle signs: hair thinning, constant fatigue, or nausea that could not be explained by hunger alone. Every symptom was a reminder that the world had changed permanently, that the environment itself had turned lethal, and that survival required constant awareness. Even shelters offered no guarantee of safety. Basements, bunkers, and improvised tents could protect from wind and fire, but could not entirely shield from radiation creeping in through cracks, vents, or contaminated materials. Dust settled on every surface, entering lungs and skin, and survivors learned to clean obsessively, wiping every surface, shaking every blanket, and filtering every drop of water. The ritual became obsessive, a necessary armor against an enemy that could not be confronted directly. Nutrition was a fragile battle. Food scavenged from abandoned stores or homes was often tainted or expired. Cooking with limited fuel was a gamble. Overheat and the fire would draw attention. Undercook and the meal could make a survivor sick. Rationing became an art. Every calorie was precious, and hunger amplified every tension, every argument, every decision to share or hoard. Illness was never far behind. Survivors learned to treat minor ailments with herbs, boiled water, or rest, improvising remedies in a world where medicine had become relics and memory. Social dynamics were strained under the pressure of illness and scarcity. Those who fell sick were often isolated, not out of cruelty, but necessity. Groups were fragile, trust scarce, and compassion measured against survival. Decisions about who to help, when to risk going into contaminated zones, or how to allocate food were ethical minefields. Every choice carried moral weight, every failure a potential death. Survivors learned quickly that illness was not only a physical threat, but a test of humanity itself. Yet even in this poisoned world, small victories emerged. A clean patch of water discovered after careful testing, a cache of uncontaminated food, a survivor recovering from mild radiation exposure. These were moments of triumph that validated the struggle. Knowledge, observation, patience, and creativity became lifelines. Survival was no longer about strength alone, but about wisdom, timing, and adaptability. Through sickness, fear, and exhaustion, survivors endured. Radiation and illness were ever present, invisible threats that demanded respect and caution. Yet the human spirit remained stubborn. Even when bodies weakened and hearts ached, survivors pressed forward, scavenging, exploring, adapting. They endured not because the world was safe, but because it demanded endurance. They survived not because they were immune to harm, but because they refused to surrender. In this shadow of nuclear devastation, life had narrowed to its purest form, every breath a struggle, every step a calculation, every decision a test. Radiation could kill, illness could claim the weak, and the environment offered no mercy. But survival was possible, and it was the only measure that mattered. The survivors carried the memory of the world before and the weight of the world after, and in this duality, they found purpose. To survive was to honor the lives lost, to challenge the devastation, and to cling stubbornly to the fragile promise of tomorrow. In a world reduced to ash and rubble, humans discovered that survival depended not only on skill and courage, but also on others. The post-nuclear landscape had turned the familiar rules of society upside down. Governments, armies, and laws no longer existed. Morality was measured in choices that could mean life or death. Trust had become a fragile and precious currency, and every human encounter carried the weight of uncertainty. Small groups of survivors began to form. They were tenuous alliances, bound together by necessity rather than loyalty. Each member brought something to the fragile collective: knowledge of scavenging, strength, skill in crafting, or the ability to keep watch. Together, they could move through dangerous ruins more safely, share limited resources, and protect one another from threats that one alone could not face. The act of cooperation was instinctual, yet terrifying. Every person carried their own fears, grief, and secrets, any one of which could disrupt the fragile balance. Conflict was never far behind. Hunger gnawed relentlessly, and scarcity bred desperation. Even within groups, disputes erupted over food, water, or the distribution of scavenged resources. Arguments flared quickly, voices sharp and desperate, and sometimes a single misstep, an accusation, a glance, a gesture, could erupt into violence. Survival demanded diplomacy as much as courage, and leaders, often chosen by instinct rather than election, carried the burden of guiding others while balancing fairness with the cold calculus of who could live. Strangers in the ruins were unpredictable. Some offered companionship, protection, or vital knowledge. Others were predators, willing to kill or steal for a morsel of food or a single bottle of water. The first greeting was often cautious, measured. Every tone, every movement, every glance was scrutinized. A wrong interpretation could mean death. Survivors learned to observe, to read body language, to weigh intentions before revealing themselves. In a world stripped of law, human instinct became the ultimate judge. Even when cooperation emerged, it was tinged with fragility. Bonds formed quickly and could dissolve just as fast. A group that had shared meals, watched over one another, and scavenged together could fragment when a sudden danger appeared. Fear, exhaustion, and hunger eroded patience and compassion, and sometimes survival required leaving others behind. These choices weighed heavily on conscience, but there was no alternative. In the post-nuclear world, survival demanded ruthless honesty with oneself and others, yet alliances also brought life. Groups could coordinate scavenging runs, guard against radiation zones, and share knowledge of safe paths, clean water, and edible food. Survivors learned to trade skills and resources, forming networks of interdependence. Even a momentary act of trust, a shared meal, a lookout posted, a hand offered in lifting debris, became a lifeline. Compassion survived alongside desperation, fragile but persistent, a reminder that humanity could endure even under unimaginable pressure. Conflict, however, remained omnipresent. Groups encountered one another across ruined streets or abandoned towns, and interactions could shift instantly from negotiation to battle. Decisions were rapid and brutal. Should they share resources, flee, or fight? The consequences were immediate. Death often resulted from hesitation, miscalculation, or misplaced trust. Survivors learned quickly that the post-nuclear world demanded both vigilance and pragmatism, that morality was complicated by circumstance, and that every human connection carried risk. Leadership emerged as both necessity and burden. In every group, someone had to make decisions, often with incomplete information. Routes through the ruins had to be chosen, rations distributed, watch rotations assigned. A wrong call could endanger the entire group. Leaders were not appointed. They were made by skill, courage, or desperation, and they carried a weight heavier than any pack of supplies. Every choice was scrutinized, every decision judged, yet indecision was often fatal. Children and the elderly added another dimension to alliances and conflicts. Protecting the vulnerable demanded more resources, slowed movement, and increased exposure to danger. Yet leaving them behind was unthinkable for many. Decisions were agonizing. Survival was not only about self-preservation, it was about weighing responsibilities, sometimes impossible ones, against the stark reality of limited resources. Parents and guardians carried fear and guilt with every step, a constant companion to the harshness of the world. Despite the tension and danger, alliances also offered hope. Shared stories around small fires, moments of laughter amidst ruins, or the act of pooling knowledge and resources reinforced a fragile sense of community. In a world dominated by death, fear, and scarcity, these connections reminded survivors that humanity could endure. They were fragile, fleeting, and always at risk. But they were the threads that held life together when everything else had fallen apart. Every day in the post-nuclear world was a negotiation between cooperation and conflict, trust and betrayal, survival and morality. Survivors learned quickly that the world had no guarantees, that every interaction could carry life or death consequences, and that alliances were as much about necessity as they were about choice. In this harsh new landscape, human connection was both a risk and a lifeline, a paradox that defined the experience of survival after the nuclear fire. The world outside was hostile, but humanity persisted. Survivors endured because they relied on each other when possible, fought when necessary, and adapted constantly. Alliances were tentative, conflict inevitable, yet life continued, fragile and precious, in the ruins of a civilization destroyed by fire. And in the delicate balance between trust and vigilance, survivors discovered a fundamental truth. Even in the aftermath of annihilation, humanity could survive, not unscathed, not unbroken, but alive, persistent, and defiant against a world reduced to ash. The ruins were not just empty streets and broken buildings. They were battlegrounds for survival. In the post-nuclear world, finding shelter was no longer about comfort. It was about life itself. Every night, every storm, every gust of radioactive wind reminded survivors that exposure could kill slowly or swiftly. The search for a safe haven became a daily obsession, as critical as finding water or food. Without shelter, even the strongest and most resourceful were vulnerable. Survivors scoured the skeletons of the old world, seeking spaces that offered protection from wind, radiation, and predators, both human and animal. Basements became sanctuaries, their thick concrete walls blocking some of the invisible threat that hung in the air. Collapsed buildings offered partial cover, though they were fraught with hazards: unstable floors, sharp debris, and pockets of toxic dust. Even the most promising structures demanded careful inspection and constant maintenance. One wrong move could collapse the fragile walls or ceilings, burying hope beneath rubble. Every shelter was a compromise. Open air was lethal, and the ruins offered little true protection. But survivors learned to improvise. Tarps, metal sheets, and scavenged wood were transformed into makeshift roofs and walls. Clothing and blankets became layers of insulation against cold and ash. Fire provided warmth, light, and a means to cook, but smoke could betray a hidden refuge to anyone, or anything, lurking in the ruins. Safety was always relative, temporary, and fragile. Even within shelters, the threat of radiation lingered. Ash settled everywhere, creeping in through cracks and vents. Clothing became a shield, masks a necessity, and makeshift barriers helped filter dust and particles. Survivors devised routines to clean, sweep, and seal spaces, performing these small rituals with obsessive care. Each act of preparation was a defiance against the lethal environment, a statement that life mattered, even in the shadow of annihilation. Group dynamics influenced shelter survival. Some survivors banded together to fortify a space, pooling skills and resources. Carpentry, scavenging, and knowledge of structural weaknesses became invaluable. Watch rotations were assigned, eyes scanning streets and rooftops for movement, for danger, for opportunity. Yet even in groups, tensions flared. Decisions about space, rationing, and responsibility were constant stressors. Leaders emerged, guiding the fragile communities with a mix of authority and negotiation, aware that every choice could determine life or death. Isolation was a double-edged sword. Shelters offered refuge from the world, but prolonged seclusion amplified fear and despair. Walls became both protection and prison as survivors grappled with memories, regrets, and grief. Every creak, every gust of wind, every distant crash of collapsing buildings reminded them of mortality and vulnerability. Sleep was shallow and fragmented, punctuated by nightmares of fire, radiation, and loss. Even the most secure refuge was haunted by the knowledge that the world outside could claim them at any moment. Nighttime was the most perilous. Darkness obscured hazards, amplified sounds, and concealed threats. Wolves, or mutated animals driven desperate by radiation-scarred hunger, prowled ruins, their eyes glowing in the ash. Human predators lurked in shadows, drawn to the faint warmth of fires or the scent of food. Survivors learned stealth, silence, and the art of hiding. Fires were small, quick, and strategic, providing minimal light but maximum concealment. Every precaution was necessary. Every oversight could be fatal. The shelter required constant maintenance. Makeshift walls sagged, roofs leaked, fires needed tending, water had to be filtered, and wind could destroy hours of work in minutes. Survivors invested sweat, ingenuity, and hope into spaces that offered temporary safety. They adapted, patching gaps, reinforcing supports, and improvising with whatever could be scavenged. The fragility of shelters mirrored the fragility of human life itself in this new world, a constant reminder that nothing could be taken for granted. Children were especially vulnerable. Their smaller bodies were more susceptible to radiation, illness, and environmental hazards. Survivors took extra care to create spaces where they could sleep, eat, and find moments of comfort. Every act of protection carried the weight of responsibility, as parents and guardians balanced immediate survival against the long-term need to keep hope alive. The smallest injury, illness, or exposure could tip the balance from survival to death. Despite the relentless dangers, shelters became more than just physical spaces. They were symbols of endurance. Each fortified wall, each patched roof, each improvised filtration system was a triumph against a world that seemed determined to erase humanity. In the act of creating safe spaces, survivors reclaimed a fragment of the life the bombs had destroyed. These spaces were small islands of control, of dignity, and of hope amidst chaos. Shelter and safety demanded constant vigilance, ingenuity, and collaboration. Survivors learned that protection was never absolute, that every refuge was temporary, and that the world outside was both a predator and a teacher. In constructing shelters, they built more than walls. They built a defiance against annihilation, a fragile proof that life could persist, even in a landscape scorched by fire. Every night spent in a shelter, every obstacle overcome, every creak and groan endured, became part of the survivor's ongoing story. Life was reduced to its essence: protection, warmth, sustenance, and the unwavering will to survive. Shelters were the thin line between existence and oblivion, and those who claimed them learned to defend, adapt, and persevere, knowing that tomorrow would bring the same relentless tests. In the fragile walls of their refuges, survivors found not just safety, but the first seeds of hope that life, despite everything, might endure. Hunger was relentless. It gnawed at the body, sharpened the mind, and frayed the edges of humanity in ways that no radiation, no collapsed building, and no predator could match. In the world after the nuclear fire, food was not abundant. It was a scarce, precious commodity, often more dangerous to obtain than it was to eat. Every morsel carried risk: the risk of radiation, of contamination, of violence. Survival demanded ingenuity, patience, and sometimes unimaginable moral choices. Scavenging for food had become a daily ordeal. Supermarkets, restaurants, and homes that had once overflowed with abundance now offered nothing but ash, twisted metal, or spoiled supplies. Cans, when found, were often dented, rusted, or compromised. Water, equally precious, required testing and purification. Streams could appear clean but carry the silent poison of radiation. Drinking too little brought dehydration. Drinking too much from the wrong source brought sickness. Hunger and thirst were constant companions, and every day was a test of endurance against them. Foraging was both skill and gamble. Survivors sought wild plants, berries, and roots, learning which could be eaten and which carried hidden dangers. Each bite required knowledge and caution. Some plants had absorbed radiation or toxins from the ash-laden soil. Hunting animals, when possible, demanded stealth and strength. Even scavenging corpses of the fallen presented risk. Disease, contamination, or exposure. Hunger was not merely a feeling. It was a force that shaped every decision, every movement, every interaction with the world and other survivors. Scarcity strained human relationships. Groups had to make excruciating decisions: who ate first, how much each person received, and whether to share with strangers. Even small miscalculations could spark conflict, eroding the fragile bonds of trust. Desperation twisted morality. Some stole from others, some hoarded secretly, and some gave until there was nothing left for themselves. Hunger was a silent manipulator, exposing fear, greed, and the raw will to survive. Children were the most vulnerable. They cried silently, whispered for food, or stared with hollow eyes as adults rationed the last scraps. Parents agonized over every morsel, forced to weigh their own survival against that of the young. The emotional toll was immense. Guilt and fear intertwined with exhaustion and despair, pressing heavily on hearts already burdened by loss. Hunger was not just physical, it was psychological, eroding hope and resolve with every empty stomach. Resource scarcity forced survivors into the dangerous unknown. Rivers, long forgotten or toxic, were explored in search of clean water. Roofs and upper floors of collapsed buildings were climbed to spot edible plants or abandoned food caches. Every excursion was a gamble. Exposure to radiation, falling debris, or hostile humans threatened life with every step. Hunger drove action, yet every action carried the shadow of potential death. The balance between courage and caution became a daily struggle. Food became a currency as valuable as life itself. Bartering emerged among survivors, scraps of food exchanged for tools, clothing, or information. Small acts of generosity built alliances, but deception was never far away. Every transaction required scrutiny. To trust blindly was to risk death. To trust not at all was to risk isolation and despair. Hunger forced both cooperation and betrayal in a world where every choice had consequences. The psychological strain of scarcity was relentless. Hunger sharpened instincts but dulled compassion. Exhaustion, thirst, and malnutrition blurred judgment. Survivors felt desperation clawing at their minds, driving them to actions unthinkable in the world before. Panic over supplies could escalate into fights, and a single confrontation over a can of food could result in death. Scarcity was not just a challenge. It was a relentless test of character, endurance, and humanity itself. Even so, hope persisted. Small victories, finding a hidden stash of canned beans, trapping a rabbit, or collecting rainwater, offered reprieve. Survivors celebrated quietly, savoring each morsel with reverence. These rare successes reinforced the will to live, reminding those who scavenged that life, though brutal, could continue. Every scrap of food, every drop of water, was proof that perseverance mattered. Hunger and scarcity shaped the survivors into something unrecognizable from who they had been before. Strength, cunning, patience, and ruthlessness merged with grief, compassion, and hope. Every day was an intricate dance between need and risk, survival and morality. The nuclear war had destroyed abundance, but it had not destroyed the human will to endure. Survivors learned to adapt, to scavenge, and to ration, not just for today, but for the fragile promise of tomorrow. In the quiet moments, survivors reflected on the fragility of life. The hunger that gnawed at their bellies reminded them that existence had been reduced to its barest elements: sustenance, shelter, and the unyielding desire to survive. Scarcity had stripped away illusions, revealing the raw core of humanity. And yet, in that harsh clarity, there was resilience. Even in a world scorched by fire, starved of life, and poisoned by radiation, survivors pressed on, clinging stubbornly to the possibility that life could endure. Even in a world reduced to ash, where the air burned with the memory of nuclear fire and the streets were littered with the remnants of life, hope endured. It was fragile, almost imperceptible, a flicker against the suffocating darkness. Yet for survivors, it was as essential as food, water, or shelter. Without it, the long struggle to endure, to walk through ruins, to fight hunger, radiation, and fear would have been unbearable. Hope was the invisible pulse that sustained the human spirit, the quiet force that urged them forward when every instinct screamed surrender. Small victories became lifelines. Discovering a hidden store of food, purifying a stream of water, or fortifying a shelter against the relentless wind. Each act of success, no matter how minor, reinforced the belief that survival was possible. Survivors began to notice patterns in the ruins. Which buildings held supplies? Which streets were safer from radiation? Which abandoned homes could serve as temporary refuge? Knowledge became a source of power, and sharing it fostered fragile bonds between those willing to trust one another. The human spirit manifested in simple yet profound ways. Survivors scavenged not only for sustenance, but also for remnants of beauty. A small green sprout emerging from the ash, a bird singing cautiously from a broken rooftop, or sunlight piercing through clouds heavy with smoke. These moments, fleeting and fragile, reminded them that the world still contained life and that life could endure. Even in a city leveled by nuclear fire, nature persisted in stubborn, defiant ways, offering hope to those who chose to see it. Communities, however small, began to emerge. Survivors who had been cautious about trust gradually learned the value of cooperation. Shared meals, guarded journeys, and collective scavenging expeditions strengthened bonds. They began to rebuild routines, checking traps for food, maintaining shelters, and protecting water sources. These small acts were symbolic victories against chaos, affirmations that humanity could adapt, endure, and reclaim some semblance of control over a devastated world. Resilience, both physical and emotional, became their defining trait. Bodies weakened by hunger, illness, and radiation endured long marches through the ruins. Minds, battered by grief and fear, focused on survival tasks with precision and patience. The survivors learned to adapt, improvising tools from scrap, creating masks and filters from cloth, rationing supplies with exacting care, and reinforcing shelters against wind, rain, and collapse. Every act of ingenuity was a statement. We will survive, despite everything. Even the young, previously helpless, learned. Children scavenged under watchful eyes, contributed to small tasks, and absorbed the grim lessons of survival. They discovered courage, awareness, and determination. In them, the older survivors glimpsed continuity, the chance that the human story could endure beyond themselves. Teaching them was an act of defiance, a message that life, even after fire and ash, was worth preserving. Moments of shared humanity emerged amid hardship. Laughter, though rare, echoed through ruined streets when a small victory was won. A trap caught a rabbit, a stream proved drinkable, or a fire burned without smoke. Stories of the past were told and retold, grounding survivors in the memory of life before the war, and sometimes serving as maps of what had been lost. Music, song, and whispered words carried significance beyond their content. They were reminders that even in devastation, humanity could find expression, connection, and meaning. Hope also inspired risk-taking, tempered by wisdom. Survivors ventured farther than they had dared before, not out of recklessness, but out of necessity and belief in the possibility of finding more. Each expedition required courage, calculation, and careful observation. They learned to read the terrain, predict danger, and manage their resources meticulously. These acts of measured bravery were testimonies to resilience, proof that even in a hostile, poisoned world, life could persist when tempered with intelligence and care. Psychologically, hope was a survival mechanism. It allowed the survivors to endure endless hardships, to recover from mistakes, to persevere through hunger, illness, and fear. Without hope, exhaustion and despair would have consumed them, leaving only the empty husks of those who once were. It was fragile and easily broken, but even in moments of darkness, it could rekindle with the discovery of water, food, or a safe shelter. And so survivors pressed onward, step by step, day by day, balancing fear with determination, scarcity with ingenuity, death with life. Every act of endurance, every cautious victory, every small victory over hunger, radiation, or threat became part of the ongoing proof that humanity could persist. The nuclear war had shattered the world, reduced cities to rubble, and poisoned the land. Yet those who survived found a way to endure. They carried memory, grief, and fear alongside courage, resourcefulness, and hope, blending them into a form of resilience uniquely human. In the ruins of the old world, among ash and shadow, survivors discovered that survival was not merely physical. It was emotional, moral, and spiritual. To endure was to defy annihilation, to reclaim agency, and to nurture the fragile belief that life could continue. Hope and resilience became inseparable. One fueled the other, and both became the defining characteristic of those who had witnessed fire and survived the aftermath. The world had become a shadow of its former self. Cities lay in ruins, forests were scarred, and rivers glimmered with the echo of fire and radiation. Survivors moved cautiously, their lives measured by hunger, radiation, and the ever-present risk of violence. Yet despite the ash, the silence, and the ghostly emptiness, something persisted. A signal, faint and fragile, but unmistakably alive. It began as a whisper in the static, a crackle through a salvaged radio, a hum from a generator long abandoned. The signal was weak, intermittent, barely perceptible against the endless hiss of decay. Yet it was enough. Enough to remind survivors that life, in some form, continued beyond the ruins they walked. Every few hours, a brief transmission broke through, a voice, words, music, or even just tones that carried meaning to ears desperate for connection. The world felt less empty when the signal arrived, as if someone, somewhere, was reaching across the void to say, "You are not alone." The survivors, weary from scavenging, from hunger, from radiation and loss, gathered around the devices they had salvaged. Radios, batteries, makeshift antennas, they became lifelines, fragile cords tethering them to humanity beyond the ashes. Every crackle, every distortion, every brief message was met with hope, anticipation, and sometimes tears. They listened not only for information, but for affirmation, proof that the human spirit had endured the fire, that they were not the last. The signal carried more than news. It carried connection. Names of survivors, coded instructions, melodies, or simply human voices reminded those in the ruins that memory and hope could survive even in devastation. It became a ritual, turning on the device, adjusting the antenna, listening to the static, waiting for the moment when life would reach across the void. Each success was a small victory against despair, a reminder that the world was not entirely lost. Yet the signal was fragile. Power was scarce, devices fragile, and the radiation-scarred environment interfered with reception. Sometimes days passed without a single transmission, leaving silence heavier than the ruins themselves. These periods tested the resilience of those who listened, forcing them to rely on each other, on their own skills, and on the determination that had carried them this far. They learned patience, endurance, and the understanding that hope was a light easily dimmed but never fully extinguished. Survivors began to document the signal, recording fragments, noting patterns, mapping sources, and attempting to extend the fragile network. It became a collective project, a testament to their persistence. Each new transmission was dissected for meaning, clues, and reassurance. They began to talk about it, to hope together, and in doing so, they rediscovered a fundamental truth. Even in the darkest landscape, human connection was vital, and the act of seeking it strengthened their will to survive. The signal became a metaphor as much as a practical tool. It was proof that the world still contained life, possibility, and the chance for continuity. Every message, no matter how brief or garbled, reminded survivors that even after fire, radiation, and ruin, humanity could endure. The ashes had destroyed cities, governments, and comfort, but they had not destroyed resilience, intelligence, or the drive to connect. The signal was small, but it was proof that life could persist. Some listened in silence. Others spoke to the voices across the static. Some wept openly for the first time since the war. Each reaction was valid. Each display of emotion a recognition of the magnitude of their existence. The signal reminded them that grief and hope could coexist, that loss was profound, but survival carried meaning beyond mere endurance. It reminded them that even among the ruins, humanity remained, fragile but unbroken. In the aftermath of destruction, survivors realized that survival was not just about food, shelter, or avoiding radiation. It was about connection, memory, and purpose. The last signal symbolized everything they had endured: hunger, fear, illness, conflict, and despair. It represented resilience, courage, ingenuity, and hope. It was proof that the human spirit, even when tested by fire and ash, could reach across the void, touch another life, and affirm existence. Even as the world lay in ruins, even as cities crumbled and the landscape remained scarred by fire and radiation, survivors persisted. They scavenged, healed, rebuilt shelters, nurtured children, defended each other, and, above all, listened for the signal. They were the living testament to human endurance, proof that even when the world was shattered, life, connection, and hope could remain. The last signal was not a promise that the world would return to what it had been. It was not a guarantee that civilization would rise again in its former glory, but it was a promise of survival, a reminder that humanity could endure, adapt, and find meaning in even the harshest reality. Survivors carried it with them, a flickering beacon of resilience, a thread connecting past, present, and future. And in that fragile light, they understood something profound. The world had ended, but life, courage, and hope had not. Even in ruins, humanity survived. And as long as the last signal continued, however faint, it would guide them forward through the darkness, reminding them that they were still here, still alive, and still capable of reaching across the void to one another.